Imagine the very first sound you hear is the sharp, metallic strike of a hammer hitting iron. One blow, then another. Each impact echoes like it is hitting the bones of the universe. You hear a breath being drawn in, shallow and ragged, as if the air itself struggles to move. The rhythm is slow at first, then steadies into a dreadful pattern. Then, without warning, everything cuts to absolute silence. A silence so vast and endless, it feels like creation itself is holding its breath. In that silence, you are no longer standing on earth. You are somewhere far above it, in a realm where time began and where time will end. Now imagine you are not simply watching this moment as a human observer. Imagine you are one of the beings who existed before stars were born, before the first mountain stood, before the first heartbeat echoed in a human chest. Imagine you are a heavenly being who has seen worlds shaped by a single word spoken from the mouth of God. You have witnessed galaxies spread like paint across the night sky. You have heard choirs that shook the foundations of eternity. You have stood in the presence of the one who crafted everything, and you have sung his praise since before the first sunrise. And now, in this silence, you look down and see something you were never prepared to witness. You see the Creator himself, the one whose voice brought light into existence, being lifted onto a wooden cross by human hands. You watch the hammer rise and fall. You watch the splinters of the cross tremble with each blow. You see the blood, the strain, the agony, and you know exactly who hangs there. The one you have worshipped for ages beyond counting now suffers at the hands of the very creatures he formed from dust. So here is the question that pulls you straight into the center of this story. If you were that heavenly being, if you had existed since before time, if you had unimaginable power at your command, what would you do when you saw the Creator being crucified? What would rise in your heart? Shock? Rage? A desire to descend in an instant and tear apart anyone who dared lay a hand on him? Or would you freeze, unable to understand how the one who formed all things could allow himself to be treated like this? The truth is even more dramatic than the question, because the heavenly beings were watching. They were witnessing every moment. And although they possessed power beyond anything we can imagine, they were given a command that shook all of heaven. They were commanded not to intervene, not to rescue, not to shield him, not to strike down his enemies. They could act in an instant, but they were ordered to stand still. They were ordered to watch the one they loved suffer and die. In the next hour, we will walk through this story exactly the way heaven saw it, from the glory before creation, to the quiet agony of Gethsemane, to the cruelty of the cross, to the explosion of triumph at the resurrection. We will step into the emotions, the shock, the confusion, and the awe of the heavenly beings who look down on the greatest act of love the universe has ever known. This is not just history. This is the moment when eternity trembled, and you are about to see it through the eyes of heaven. Before we journey deeper into this story, we need to lay the foundation for everything that will unfold over the next hour. At the heart of this video lies one central question, a question so profound that it stretches across history, theology, and the unseen realms. What did the heavenly beings do when they saw the Creator hanging on a cross? To answer that question, we will not rely on imagination alone. We will follow the historical record preserved in the Scriptures. We will consider the emotional and psychological perspective of the heavenly beings who witnessed these events, and we will reflect on the theological meaning behind every moment. This approach will allow us to see both the cosmic scale and the personal weight of the crucifixion. Throughout the story, you will hear several key references from the Bible, each read in its full verbal form, so you can follow the timeline clearly. For example, Luke chapter 22, verse 43, Matthew chapter 26, and Matthew chapter 27. John, especially the chapters that describe the arrest, trial, and death of Jesus. Isaiah, with special focus on the descriptions of the suffering servant. Psalm 22, which contains prophetic imagery of the crucifixion written long before it happened, and Revelation, which gives us glimpses into how heaven sees the Lamb who was slain. Each time a passage is mentioned, the exact reference will be displayed on the screen so that you can track the story and explore it further on your own. As we begin this hour-long journey, here is the roadmap for what you can expect. First, we will step back and look at the background leading up to the crucifixion, including the role of heavenly beings throughout the story of creation and redemption. Then we will enter Gethsemane, where the suffering of Jesus begins in a way only heaven could fully understand. From there, we will walk through the arrest, the trials, and the rising tension as the heavenly beings watch the Creator handed over to human authorities. After that, we will stand at the foot of the cross during the crucifixion itself, observing each moment from both an earthly and a heavenly perspective. We will then explore the cosmic signs that accompanied his death, the eerie silence that followed, and the long pause of the day in between. Finally, we will witness the resurrection morning, the thunder of victory, and the lasting effects these events have on heaven and earth. This is not simply a retelling. It is an attempt to understand what it meant for heaven to watch love take on its greatest cost. And now, with the foundation set, we step into the story. Before we can understand what the heavenly beings felt, thought, or did during the crucifixion, we must first understand who they are. Many people imagine angels as small, winged infants floating peacefully on clouds, the kind often seen on holiday cards or in Renaissance artwork. But the picture given in Scripture is far more powerful, far more awe-inspiring, and far more overwhelming than anything our culture typically portrays. The heavenly beings are not fragile figures or decorative symbols. They are ancient, intelligent, radiant beings created by God long before humanity took its first breath. They are servants, warriors, messengers, and worshippers whose existence stretches back to the dawn of creation. One of the clearest descriptions we have comes from Hebrews chapter 1, verse 14. In that passage, the angels are described as ministering spirits sent to serve those who will inherit salvation. This tells us two important things. The first is that angels are spiritual beings rather than physical creatures made of flesh and bone. The second is that they are servants assigned to specific missions by God, and their work is directly connected to the story of humanity. They are not passive observers. They are active participants in God's unfolding plan. Another vivid picture comes from Isaiah chapter 6, where the prophet describes seeing the Lord seated on a throne, high and lifted up, with seraphim surrounding him. The seraphim are heavenly beings with 6 wings. With 2 wings they cover their faces, with 2 wings they cover their feet, and with 2 wings they fly. They cry out, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts," and the sound of their voices shakes the very foundations of the temple. This is not a gentle or quiet moment. This is raw, overwhelming power. When Isaiah describes this scene, he is trying to capture the awe that comes with standing near beings created for pure worship, beings whose very presence vibrates with spiritual intensity. We also find a glimpse of angelic existence in Job chapter 38, where God reminds Job that when the earth was created, the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. This tells us that the angels were present during the creation of the world. They watched as mountains rose, oceans formed, and stars were placed in the sky. They were the first witnesses to the power of God displayed in the physical universe. They have seen things no human eye has ever seen, and they have existed through ages that stretch beyond our understanding of time. Angels are not all the same. Scripture shows that there are different types, roles, and ranks within the heavenly realm. The seraphim, as described in Isaiah, are beings of worship who remain close to the presence of God. The cherubim, described in various passages, are not chubby children with wings, but mighty guardians associated with the holiness of God. They appear protecting the entrance to the Garden of Eden after the fall of humanity. and the imagery of cherubim appears throughout the design of the temple and the Ark of the Covenant. Then there are the archangels, among whom Michael is the most clearly named. Michael appears in several key moments throughout Scripture as a warrior and defender. He contends against spiritual darkness, leads heavenly armies, and stands as a protector of God's people. When Jesus mentions that he could ask the Father to send more than 12 legions of angels, the image is one of countless heavenly warriors standing ready under the command of beings like Michael. A Roman legion often consisted of 5,000 to 6,000 soldiers. 12 legions of heavenly warriors means more than 70,000 powerful, radiant, battle-ready beings prepared to descend instantly if commanded. With all this power, some may assume that angels know everything or see everything, but Scripture makes it clear that this is not the case. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, explains that there are things even angels long to look into. This means that their understanding, though vast, is not unlimited. There are mysteries within God's plan that unfold in real time, and the angels learn as those events take place. They are not equal to God. They do not possess his infinite knowledge or his eternal sovereignty. They obey, they watch, they learn, and at times they must trust in the plan even when they do not understand it fully. Throughout the pages of Scripture, we see angels fulfilling several key roles. They act as messengers, appearing to people with announcements from God. They act as protectors, defending individuals or entire nations when instructed. They act as warriors, battling against dark spiritual forces. They act as guides, giving direction or warning to those chosen for specific missions. And above all, they act as worshippers, continually giving praise to the one who created them. In every story, one truth remains constant. Angels act with absolute loyalty and perfect obedience. They do not improvise or hesitate. They move the instant they are commanded, and they refrain from acting the moment they are told to stand still. Their identity is not based on independent authority, but on unwavering devotion to the will of God. Understanding who the angels are helps us grasp the weight of what they experienced during the crucifixion. These are beings who have seen the power and glory of the Creator firsthand. These are beings who have delivered his messages, carried out his judgments, and sung his praise for countless ages. And these are the same beings who stood in silence as the one they adored was lifted onto a cross. They had power beyond measure, yet they were commanded not to intervene. Everything in their nature called them to act, and yet they were told to watch. Knowing the strength, intelligence, and devotion of the angels allows us to feel the full gravity of that moment. Their silence was not weakness. Their restraint was not indifference. Their stillness was obedience. And it is only by understanding who they truly are that we can understand the depth of that obedience as the story continues. To understand what the heavenly beings felt when they looked upon the crucifixion, we must first understand everything they had already seen. Their story does not begin at the cross. It does not even begin with humanity. It begins long before the creation of the world, in ages so ancient that human language can barely describe them. The angels had been present through the entire history of redemption. They had watched every rise and fall, every blessing and every failure, every act of divine mercy, and every act of divine judgment. They were the first witnesses to the power of God written across the universe, and they were also witnesses to the long and painful story of humanity. When the crucifixion arrived, they did not watch as strangers. They watched as beings who had seen everything that came before it. The story begins in the book of Job. In Job chapter 38, verse 7, God speaks of the time when the foundations of the earth were laid, and he describes the angels as the morning stars who sang together, and the sons of God who shouted for joy. This means that before a single human foot touched the soil of Eden, angels were already watching. They saw the earth formed, oceans carved, mountains lifted, and stars scattered into the sky. They watched creation unfold like the greatest masterpiece ever painted. With every new command spoken by God, they saw galaxies burst forth and life appear where there had been nothing. Imagine a choir of countless heavenly beings watching the birth of the universe and responding with thunderous joy. That was their first memory of God's power. They were also present in Eden. They watched when Adam first opened his eyes and breathed his first breath. They saw the wonder of innocence, purity, and harmony as the first humans walked with God in perfect peace. They saw creation working as it was meant to work, and they also witnessed the tragedy of the fall. They saw Adam and Eve choose disobedience. They saw the fruit taken, the trust broken, and the relationship between God and humanity shattered. When Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden, the cherubim were placed at the entrance with a flaming sword. These guardians became the symbol of separation, a visible reminder that sin had built a barrier that only God himself could one day remove. The angels also watched as humanity spiraled further into corruption. They saw the violence and wickedness that filled the earth before the days of Noah. They witnessed the grief of God as the world he created drowned itself in sin. When the flood came, they saw both judgment and mercy as Noah and his family were preserved. They saw the Tower of Babel rise in arrogance and fall in confusion. They saw nations form, kings rise, wars begin, and empires crumble. Through every age, they observed human hearts drifting further away from the Creator. Yet the story was not only filled with darkness. The angels also witnessed moments of faith, courage, and divine intervention. They visited Abraham, promising him a son when his body was old and his wife barren. They appeared again when judgment approached Sodom. They protected Lot, demonstrating both mercy and warning. They watched Jacob wrestle through the night. They appeared in dreams, steering kings and prophets toward God's plan. They shut the mouths of lions when Daniel was thrown into their den. They stood in fiery presence with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in Babylon, ensuring that flames intended for destruction became flames that proclaimed God's glory. They saw the birth of Israel, the giving of the law, the rise of prophets, and the long, slow preparation for the arrival of the Messiah. They were there when Isaiah described the one who would be pierced, the one who would carry humanity's grief. They understood the prophecy but did not yet understand how it would unfold. They longed to see the rest of the story, but it remained hidden from them. Then came the night that changed everything. The angels who had watched humanity struggle for centuries suddenly exploded into celebration over a field in Bethlehem. A multitude of heavenly hosts appeared to shepherds, praising God and proclaiming peace on earth. For the first time, they saw the Creator not creating galaxies, not speaking from glory, not descending in fire, but lying in a manger as a fragile baby. They marveled as the infinite God wrapped himself in human flesh. They watched him grow. They watched him learn to walk, to work, to speak. They saw him live among the people he created. They watched him touch lepers, calm storms, raise the dead, and forgive sinners. They saw power and compassion intertwined in a way no heavenly being had witnessed before. Over the 33 years that Jesus walked the earth, the angels became familiar with his human life. They had seen his glory before, but now they saw his humility. They had known his sovereignty, but now they saw his service. They had seen him rule the heavens, but now they watched him wash the feet of his disciples. They were present when he was tempted in the wilderness. They ministered to him when his body was exhausted and weak. They knew the Father's voice spoke over him at his baptism. They saw the miracles that proved his divinity and the love that revealed his heart. By the time the final week approached, the angels had seen so much of the power and goodness of Jesus that they could never have imagined what would come next. They had seen him command storms, demons, sickness, and death. They had seen him teach crowds with authority no human had ever possessed. They had seen his compassion for the broken and his patience with those who doubted. They had become so accustomed to witnessing his authority that the idea of him suffering, bleeding, and dying at the hands of violent men must have seemed impossible. And yet, as the final days unfolded, the angels began to sense something shifting. The tone of Jesus' words changed. The prophecies he mentioned became clearer. The tension in Jerusalem grew heavier. For the first time in their long existence, the angels were about to see something they had never seen before, the one they adored walking willingly towards suffering. Everything they had witnessed in the long history of redemption prepared them for this moment, but nothing could soften the shock of what was about to happen. As the final weeks of Jesus' earthly ministry began to unfold, the heavenly beings observed a shift unlike anything they had witnessed in their long history of watching God's plan develop. They had seen Jesus teach with power. They had seen him perform miracles that defied natural law. They had seen him confront darkness with authority and compassion. But now, his words carried a new tone, one that was heavier, one that felt like a shadow gradually moving across the sunlight. This change became unmistakable when Jesus began to speak openly about his coming, suffering, and death. According to Matthew chapter 16, verse 21, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, that he would suffer many things from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and that he would be killed and raised again on the third day. Those words must have struck the heavenly beings with a strange mixture of recognition and confusion. They had heard the prophecies spoken centuries earlier. They had seen the writings of Isaiah describing a suffering servant, a man wounded for humanity's transgressions. They had listened to the words of Psalm 22, which spoke of pierced hands and surrounded bones. They knew the plan had always involved sacrifice. But hearing Jesus speak about his own death with such clarity made the prophecy real in a way that nothing before had. The angels must have felt the tension building as Jesus continued traveling toward Jerusalem. As the final Passover approached, Jesus entered the city riding on a donkey while crowds surrounded him shouting, "Hosanna!" They laid palm branches in the road and proclaimed him as the one who came in the name of the Lord. The angels had seen moments of worship before, but this scene carried a bittersweet edge. They knew that the same voices shouting joyfully would soon be drowned out by the cries of those calling for his crucifixion. They must have sensed the rising conflict in the hearts of the religious leaders. For years, those leaders had grown increasingly resistant to Jesus' teachings. His miracles threatened their authority. His compassion exposed their hypocrisy. His truth unsettled their control. Now, with the crowds lifting him up as king, their fear and anger reached a breaking point. Jesus did not calm the tension. Instead, he went directly to the temple and cleansed it, overturning tables and driving out the merchants who had turned God's house into a marketplace. This act created an earthquake in the religious structure of the city. To the heavenly beings, it was clear that Jesus was not trying to avoid conflict. He was walking straight into it. They watched the leaders' faces tighten with hatred. They heard whispered plans turning into determination. They saw the storm gathering. Yet even with the weight of his coming suffering pressing upon him, Jesus focused on his disciples. In the upper room, he gathered them for what would become known as the Last Supper. The angels must have watched with awe as the one who created the universe tied a towel around his waist and washed the feet of his followers, showing them the kind of love they were called to carry into the world. Then he broke the bread and lifted the cup, giving them a ritual that would echo throughout history. He told them the bread was his body, given for them, and the cup was his blood, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. The angels understood the symbolism better than the disciples did. They knew this was a farewell meal, a covenant being sealed, a moment heavy with eternal significance. But the most revealing moment of the evening was the prayer recorded in John chapter 17. In that prayer, often called the high priestly prayer, Jesus spoke with the Father in words filled with tenderness, longing, and purpose. He prayed for his disciples, for those who would believe in him through their message, and for the unity and protection of all who would follow him. He also declared, "Father, the hour has come." Those words must have struck the angels like a bell ringing through the halls of heaven. They knew exactly what that hour meant. They knew that this was the moment toward which all of history had been moving. They could feel the weight of what was approaching. The angels had watched Jesus face danger before, but never with this kind of quiet acceptance. He was not resisting. He was not escaping. He was walking toward his suffering with a resolve that felt sacred. As they looked down, they saw him leave the upper room and walk toward the Garden of Gethsemane. With each step, the tension grew. The night air in Jerusalem seemed to thicken. The disciples followed, confused and fearful, unaware of the darkness that had already begun to gather around their master. The angels could sense every detail of the moment. They felt the shift in the spiritual atmosphere. They saw the forces of darkness closing in. They knew betrayal was already on its way. The rhythm of the final week moved from celebration to confrontation, from teaching to warning, from hope to a rising sense of dread. The heavenly beings, who had always seen Jesus act from a place of authority and strength, were about to witness him enter the deepest sorrow of his earthly life. Nothing about this felt accidental. Every moment had the weight of destiny. And as Jesus arrived in Gethsemane, the angels understood that the story of redemption was reaching its most critical hour. The pace of events had quickened. The air was heavy, the disciples were weary, the city was restless, and the heavenly beings, who had watched every chapter of human history, now braced themselves for the chapter that would change everything. Gethsemane. Even the name carries weight. In its original meaning, it refers to an oil press, the place where olives are crushed so that oil can flow out. It is a quiet garden at the base of the Mount of Olives, but on that night, it became the place where the soul of Jesus was pressed with a weight deeper than any physical burden. The heavenly beings who had watched him walk through the streets of Jerusalem now watched him step into the darkness of this garden, and they understood that something sacred and terrible was beginning. The garden was still. The trees stood like silent witnesses, their branches stretching overhead as though trying to shield the one beneath them. Jesus went with his disciples, but his grief separated him from them almost immediately. He told them that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow, even to the point of death. Then he went farther into the garden, leaving them behind, and fell to the ground in prayer. The angels had seen him pray before. They had heard him speak to the Father with joy, with resolve, and with authority, but never like this. This time his prayer carried the weight of every sin that had ever been committed, and every sin that would ever be committed. It carried the weight of judgment, separation, and suffering that no human could imagine. This prayer was not gentle or peaceful. It was agony. Luke chapter 22, verse 44 describes Jesus being in such deep anguish that his sweat became like great drops of blood falling to the ground. This is a condition known as hematidrosis, where extreme emotional stress causes the tiny blood vessels beneath the skin to burst, mixing blood with sweat. For the heavenly beings, who had seen Jesus as the radiant creator of all things, hearing his labored breaths and seeing his body respond to sorrow in this way must have been unbearable. But in the verse just before that, in Luke chapter 22, verse 43, something extraordinary happens. A heavenly being is sent from heaven to strengthen him. This moment is one of the most mysterious and paradoxical scenes in the entire story of redemption. The one who spoke the worlds into existence, the one who commands legions of angels, the one whom the seraphim worship endlessly with cries of "Holy, holy, holy," is now being strengthened by one of his own creations. The angels must have watched this with a mixture of reverence and shock. To strengthen Jesus did not mean to relieve him of his suffering. It meant to help him endure it. The heavenly being did not come to rescue him, but to steady him. It is difficult to imagine the emotional weight of that assignment. For countless ages, the angels had known Jesus in glory. They had seen him in power, in brilliance, in authority. Now they saw him trembling under the crushing burden of the world's sin. The heavenly being who approached him must have felt something no angel had ever felt before. The sorrow of helping the Almighty continue towards suffering. What of the other angels? What of the thousands, maybe millions, who were ready to descend at his command? They would have sensed every moment of his agony. They would have heard his words as he prayed, "Father, if you are willing, let this cup pass from me." And then, with a strength deeper than agony, "Yet not my will, but yours be done." They must have felt torn between a fierce desire to intervene and the unbreakable command to remain still. The angels were made to act. They were warriors, protectors, messengers. But here, their nature collided with their orders. They had the power to destroy the soldiers who were already on their way. They had the power to lift Jesus out of the garden and carry him to safety in an instant. And yet, they were commanded to do nothing. For beings created for obedience, the struggle between instinct and command must have cut deeply. As Jesus rose from the ground and turned toward his approaching captors, the heavenly beings knew the crushing had only begun. Every breath, every step, every heartbeat would press him further. And they, the ones who had watched him in glory, would now watch him walk willingly into suffering no angel could fully comprehend. Gethsemane had marked the beginning of the greatest surrender in history, and heaven trembled at what was still to come. The quiet heaviness of Gethsemane was shattered by the sound of footsteps, torchlight flickering between the branches, and the tension of betrayal hanging in the air. The heavenly beings, who had watched Jesus rise from his knees after praying in anguish, now saw the familiar figure of Judas walking toward him. Judas had been a disciple, a man who had walked with Jesus, eaten with him, and heard his teachings for years. Now he approached with soldiers at his back, carrying the cold certainty of treachery in his eyes. The angels saw him step forward and greet Jesus with a kiss. A kiss, meant to be a sign of affection and respect, became instead the mark that identified the one who would be taken away. For the angels, this moment was more jarring than any battle they had ever witnessed. They had seen rebellion in heaven long ago, but betrayal on earth carried a different sting. This was personal. This was intimate. This was the wound of a friend. The soldiers moved quickly, stepping forward to seize Jesus. The disciples, overwhelmed by fear and confusion, reacted in desperation. Peter, driven by the instinct to protect the teacher he loved, drew his sword and struck a servant of the high priest named Malchus. The angels saw the blade flash and saw the ear fall. In that instant, the heavenly beings could have joined Peter. They could have unleashed power beyond anything these soldiers had ever imagined. But before any of them could even stir, Jesus stopped the chaos. He commanded Peter to put away the sword, and then he reached out and healed the servant's ear. In the middle of his own arrest, he chose mercy. Then he spoke the words that ricocheted through the heavenly realms. He said that if he wished, he could ask the Father, and the Father would send more than 12 legions of angels. 12 legions. In Roman terms, that meant well over 70,000 soldiers. For the angels, this was not a metaphor. It was reality. They stood ready. They could have descended in a blazing storm, ending the arrest and scattering his enemies in seconds. The heavenly host waited for even the slightest signal, but no signal came. Jesus made it clear that he would not call them, because the scriptures had to be fulfilled. The angels watched as Jesus was led away first to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. These were the religious authorities of the nation, the ones who should have recognized him, the ones who had studied the scriptures that pointed directly to him. Instead, they sought false witnesses, twisting evidence and crafting accusations. The angels had seen earthly injustice before, but this trial was different. This was the author of truth being condemned by lies. They saw Jesus stand silent before his accusers, fulfilling the words spoken centuries earlier by the prophet Isaiah, who had described him as a lamb led to slaughter, silent before its shearers. To the angels, his silence was almost unbearable. A single word from him could have turned the entire courtroom upside down. A single command could have dropped every accuser to the ground. Yet he chose not to defend himself. From the Sanhedrin, Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate. Here, Roman power and political fear collided with spiritual reality. Pilate could find no guilt in him, yet he wavered in the face of pressure. The angels saw Pilate question Jesus. They saw him hesitate, negotiate, deflect, and ultimately surrender to the will of the crowd. When the mob shouted for crucifixion, the angels felt a surge of indignation. They knew who Jesus was. They had seen him in glory. They had watched him create the stars. And now they watched as human voices demanded his death. Pilate washed his hands, claiming innocence. But the angels knew that human rituals cannot wash away guilt. What struck them most deeply, however, was not the corruption of the court or the deception of leaders. It was the fact that they were forbidden to intervene. They had the power to tear open the sky, to stop every soldier, to break every chain, but they were commanded to remain still. Their stillness was not weakness, it was obedience, and that obedience allowed the plan of redemption to move forward. As Jesus was handed over to be crucified, the heavenly beings understood what few on earth could comprehend. Every injustice, every lie, every blow, and every sentence was part of the mission he had chosen. The angels did not fail to act. They obeyed the command of heaven. And with that obedience, the path to the cross was set. The journey from the place of sentencing to the place of execution was not long in distance, but it was immeasurable in suffering. The heavenly beings who had watched Jesus stand silently through false accusations now watched him step onto the road that would lead to Golgotha. This path would later be called the Via Dolorosa, the way of sorrow, and every step along it felt like a weight placed on the heart of heaven itself. Jesus had already been scourged. The angels had watched as the Roman soldiers carried out their brutal punishment, each lash designed to tear skin and muscle. By the time he was brought out to carry the crossbeam, his body was already pushed past the limits of ordinary human endurance. The cross was not a smooth, polished symbol like those we see today. It was rough, heavy wood, splintering beneath his hands and shoulders. As the soldiers placed it on his back, the angels saw him stagger under the weight, and the sorrow in heaven deepened. He tried to walk, but his body weakened with every step. The angels could sense the pain, as though the universe itself was reacting to the Creator's suffering. Jesus fell beneath the beam more than once, his strength slipping as blood loss and exhaustion consumed him. The soldiers, impatient and irritated, grabbed a man from the crowd, a passerby named Simon of Cyrene, and forced him to carry the cross behind Jesus. This moment created a shockwave through the heavenly realms. The paradox was almost unthinkable. The Creator, the one who shaped the mountains and filled the seas, now leaned on the strength of a man he himself had formed from dust. The one who had carried the weight of the world in his hands now needed the help of an ordinary human to carry a piece of wood. No angel could miss the meaning of this moment. This was humility taken to its furthest edge, a submission so deep that even the heavenly beings struggled to comprehend it. As they continued along the road, the crowd pressed around them. Some mocked, some spat, some hurled insults. The angels heard every word, and each one stung with the sharpness of ignorance. These were the same voices that had cried Hosanna days before. Now they shouted with contempt, unaware of what was unfolding before their eyes. But not everyone in the crowd mocked. Among them were women who wept openly, overwhelmed by grief at the sight of Jesus' suffering. Their cries carried through the street, and Jesus, even in his agony, turned to them. He told them not to weep for him, but for themselves and for their children. His compassion did not break under the weight of the cross. Even in pain, His heart remained fixed on others. For the angels, this moment revealed something deeper than suffering. It revealed purpose. Their instinct, still burning within them, was to intervene, to protect, to lift him from the ground and return him to glory. But that instinct remained bound by the command of heaven. They were witnesses, not rescuers. They felt powerless, yet they were participating in the most powerful act of love ever displayed. As the procession neared Golgotha, the angels understood that each step had meaning. Jesus was not being dragged by circumstance. He was walking with intention toward the place where redemption would be accomplished. The Via Dolorosa was not only a road of pain, it was a road of purpose. And the heavenly beings, though overwhelmed with sorrow, watched with reverent understanding. The suffering of the Creator was not a sign of defeat. It was the beginning of victory, and they were witnessing the path that would lead to the moment when the world would be changed forever. The hill called Golgotha stood stark and silent against the sky, its very name meaning the place of the skull. It was a place meant for death, a place designed to break the human body and crush the human will. The angels had seen battlefields before. They had seen the consequences of human violence, the ruins of cities, and the scars left by war. But nothing they had ever witnessed compared to what they were about to see on this hill. When Jesus reached the site, the soldiers moved with a cold efficiency born from routine. Crucifixion was their craft, and they had perfected its cruelty. The angels watched as they forced Jesus onto the rough wood, his back, torn open by the scourging, pressed against splinters that dug into already open wounds. They stretched his arms along the horizontal beam, finding the precise placement where a nail driven through the wrist would hold the weight of a man. The wrist, not the palm, was strong enough to support the body during crucifixion. They touched the point between the bones, where the nail would pass through nerves that would ignite pain like fire shooting up the arms. The sound of the first hammer strike echoed across the hill. The angels felt it like a shock through the heavens. Another strike, then another. Each blow forced the nail deeper until it held the arm in place. They moved to the other side. More hammer strikes, more agony. Then they bent his knees, placed his feet together against the vertical beam, and drove a single nail through both. This nail had to be placed carefully, for it would bear the weight of Jesus as he pushed himself upward just to breathe. Once the nails were in place, the soldiers lifted the cross. As it dropped into the ground socket with a heavy thud, every wound was jolted. The angels watched his body sag forward. To inhale, he had to pull himself upward against the nails in his wrists. To exhale, he had to push against the nail in his feet. Each breath was a battle. Each moment was a choice between suffocating slowly or tearing his own wounds open for another short gasp of air. The heavenly beings, who had seen him command storms and raise the dead, now saw him struggle for every breath. Then, as the soldiers settled at the foot of the cross and divided his clothing, Jesus spoke his first words. His voice was weak, strained, yet steady. He said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Right. The angels could hardly comprehend it. Forgiveness? In this moment, they had watched humans betray him, mock him, beat him, and now crucify him. And his first act was to intercede for them. The heavenly beings who had seen divine justice exercised throughout history now saw divine mercy extended to those who had done the unthinkable. This was not justice. This was love beyond understanding. They felt the shock ripple through the heavens. The one who was suffering did not ask for rescue. He asked for mercy for his executioners. The angels, whose swords were drawn in spirit, felt their anger confronted by a love that defied every instinct they possessed. As time passed, the suffering deepened. The heat of the sun beat down. The crowd jeered. The religious leaders mocked him. The angels heard their voices saying, "He saved others but cannot save himself." They knew the truth. He was not saving himself because he was saving others. This was not inability. It was choice. On his right and left hung two criminals. One joined the mockery. The other, broken by his own guilt, recognized something the crowd did not. He asked Jesus to remember him when he came into his kingdom. And Jesus answered with his second great declaration, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." Is read. The angels saw salvation happen in real time. A man with nothing to offer, no good works, no chance to change his life, received eternal life because he recognized the one dying beside him. To the angels, this moment demonstrated the purpose of the cross itself. Even as Jesus hung dying, his mission did not slow. He came to seek and save the lost, and he continued that mission with his dying breath. One soul, broken and repentant, became the proof that redemption could reach even into the final moments of life. Hours passed. Each minute felt like an eternity. Jesus looked down and saw his mother near the cross, her heart pierced with grief. Beside her stood John. Jesus spoke again, telling Mary that John was now her son, and telling John that Mary was now his mother. Even in agony, Jesus cared for the ones he loved. The angels witnessed this act of compassion, an act that revealed his heart once more. Pain did not make him selfish. Suffering did not close his compassion. Even as life slipped away, love remained. Then came the cry that shook the universe. As darkness covered the land from noon until 3 in the afternoon, Jesus called out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" These words echoed the beginning of Psalm 22, a prophecy written long before this moment. The angels knew the words. They had heard them sung in ancient Israel, but hearing them now from the lips of the Son himself filled them with confusion and sorrow. For the first time in eternity, they sensed a separation between the Father and the Son, a rupture they could not understand. They had never seen the Son without the Father's presence. They had never heard the Son speak with such desolation. The angels stood in absolute silence. They did not know how to interpret the mystery unfolding before them. They knew that sin separates humanity from God. They knew that Jesus was bearing the sins of the world. But seeing the weight of separation fall upon him, seeing him experience the distance that sin creates, was beyond anything they had imagined. It was not just physical pain. It was spiritual agony, a darkness deeper than night. As the darkness began to lift, Jesus grew weaker. His breathing became more labored. His body trembled with exhaustion. Then he spoke again, saying, "I thirst." The angels recognized both the physical and symbolic meaning of this statement. Physically, he was dehydrated, drained, suffering. Spiritually, the one who had offered living water now asked for a drink. It was a reminder of his humanity. He was truly God, but also truly man, and he felt the full weight of human suffering. A soldier lifted a sponge soaked in sour wine and placed it on a hyssop branch, touching it to his lips. The angels watched as he tasted it. And then, with the end approaching, Jesus spoke the words that reverberated across heaven and earth. "It is finished." The word meant that the debt had been paid in full, redemption completed, judgment satisfied, the plan accomplished. These words carried a finality that shook the foundations of the spiritual realm. The angels understood instantly what it meant. The barrier between God and humanity was broken. The separation caused by sin was overcome. The redemptive work was done. Finally, with the last of his strength, Jesus cried out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." These words were not desperation. They were surrender. They were trust. They were the return of fellowship after the agony of separation. The angels sensed the shift. Jesus gave up his spirit, not because death overpowered him, but because he chose to yield to it. The author of life died by his own decision. The earth shook, rocks split. The temple veil, thick as woven carpet and towering high above the ground, tore from top to bottom. The angels understood the symbolism immediately. The barrier was gone. Access to God was no longer limited. The path to redemption was open. For 9 relentless minutes of heavenly time hours in human experience, the angels watched the most intense, painful, and awe-filled event in history. Every breath, every cry, every word carried cosmic weight. The cross was agony. It was sacrifice. It was fulfillment. And it was victory. Through the suffering of the Creator, the universe was changed forever. When Jesus released his spirit and the final word left his lips, the universe did not remain still. The heavenly beings, who had watched every moment of his suffering, now witnessed creation itself respond in ways that defied natural law. These were not subtle signs. These were not symbolic gestures. These were cosmic reactions, immediate, supernatural, unmistakable. And the angels understood that the physical world was echoing the truth of what had just taken place. The first sign came in the most dramatic and chilling form. From the 6th hour until the 9th hour, from what we would call noon until 3 in the afternoon, darkness covered the entire land. Matthew chapter 27, verse 45, records this event with simplicity, but the reality of it was profound. This was not a solar eclipse. The Passover always took place during a full moon, making a solar eclipse impossible. The angels knew this darkness came directly from the hand of God. A veil stretched over creation as the sun endured the agony of separation. The land itself seemed to mourn. The sun refused to shine. Heaven and earth stood together in solemn silence. Then came the moment when the temple veil tore from top to bottom. This veil was not a thin cloth. It was an enormous curtain, towering and thick, separating the holy place from the most holy place, the place symbolizing God's presence. No human could have torn it, certainly not from the top downward. But at the exact moment Jesus died, it split. The angels grasped the meaning instantly. For centuries, that veil had represented the barrier between sinful humanity and a holy God. Now, through the death of Jesus, that barrier had been removed. The pathway to God was open. The ministry of angels had always included guiding and protecting those who sought God. But now their roles would expand into a completely new era. Access had been granted, not through ritual, but through the sacrifice they had just witnessed. The earth shook violently. Rocks split apart. The angels watched as the ground itself trembled in a way that reflected the spiritual shift taking place. Creation had never reacted like this to the death of any man, because no other death had ever carried the weight of this one. And then, in one of the most mysterious and awe-inspiring events recorded in Scripture, tombs opened. According to Matthew chapter 27, verses 51 through 53, many saints who had died were raised to life. These resurrected individuals later entered the holy city and appeared to many. The angels, long accustomed to escorting the souls of the righteous into the presence of God, now found themselves witnessing a preview of the final resurrection. It is reasonable to imagine that they guided these newly restored saints, helping them understand their mission and the significance of the moment. But their message did not stop there. They gave the women a commission: go quickly and tell his disciples. The angels became the first messengers of the gospel, the first to proclaim that death had been conquered. At the foot of the cross, a Roman centurion who had overseen countless executions felt the weight of these signs. He had heard Jesus' words. He had seen his suffering. But it was the earthquake and the signs that broke through his hardened exterior. In Matthew chapter 27, verse 54, he declared, "Truly, this was the Son of God." The angels heard those words with profound joy. A Gentile soldier, trained in cruelty, became one of the first human witnesses to recognize the truth of what had happened. Heaven had been watching from above, but now the confession rose from earth itself. The cosmic signs were not random. They were creation's response to the death of its creator. And for the angels, each sign confirmed that the mission was unfolding exactly as the Father had determined: powerful, purposeful, and world-changing. The cross had shaken the earth. and heaven knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After the earthquake settled, after the darkness lifted, and after the body of Jesus was taken down from the cross and placed in the tomb, a strange and heavy quiet fell over both heaven and earth. The heavenly beings, who had watched the crucifixion unfold with trembling sorrow, now entered a day unlike any they had ever experienced. It was the Sabbath, yet no Sabbath had ever felt like this. It was a day of silence, a day of waiting, a day when even heaven seemed to hold its breath. The angels had always known Jesus as the author of life. They had seen him create, sustain, heal, and command. Now they saw his body lying still inside a tomb hewn from rock. The sight was almost impossible for them to comprehend. Every instinct within them longed to move, to act, to restore, to intervene. But no command came. The Father had spoken no new orders, and without a command, the angels could do nothing. Their obedience held them in place, creating the long stillness that stretched through all of heaven. Meanwhile, on earth, the religious leaders were uneasy. They remembered Jesus' words more clearly than his disciples did. They went to Pilate and asked for the tomb to be sealed and guarded. A heavy stone was rolled into place. Seals were set. Roman soldiers stood watch, elite men trained to defend the tomb with their lives. The angels observed all of this with a mixture of sorrow and quiet assurance. Humans were attempting to secure the impossible, trying to trap the Lord of life behind stone and wax. The heavenly beings understood the futility of it, yet they watched patiently as the world tried to reinforce its own misunderstanding. Inside the tomb, Jesus' body rested, but his spirit was not inactive. 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 through 20, speaks of Jesus proclaiming to the spirits in prison. Though the details of this moment remain mysterious, the angels understood one thing clearly. Jesus' work did not cease just because his body lay still. Even in death, the mission continued. Something profound was unfolding beyond human sight. Still, heaven waited. The angels had witnessed countless events in the story of redemption, creation, rebellion, covenants, miracles, prophecies, but they had never experienced a day like this, a day with no instructions, a day with no movement, a day where the plan rested in perfect, divine timing. It was, for them, the longest Saturday in the history of the universe. They did not know the exact moment when the silence would break. They did not know when the command would come, but they waited with anticipation rising inside them like a held breath, because even in the silence, they sensed it. This was not the end of the story. It was the pause before the greatest victory heaven had ever seen. Before dawn broke on the first day of the week, the silence that had hung over heaven and earth began to shift. It was subtle at first, like the stirring of wind before a storm. Then it grew, a rising sense of anticipation among the heavenly beings who had waited through the longest and quietest day in their existence. They did not know the exact second the command would come. But when it did, it moved through heaven like lightning. The waiting was over. The mission had begun. Matthew chapter 28, verse 2 describes the moment from the earthly perspective. An angel of the Lord descended from heaven, caused a great earthquake, rolled back the stone, and sat upon it. But from the heavenly perspective, this was far more than a single action. It was the explosive end of heaven's silence and the beginning of heaven's proclamation. The angel who descended did not come quietly. His appearance was described as having a countenance like lightning and clothing as white as snow. This was not gentle radiance. This was blinding, overwhelming brightness, the kind of presence that made soldiers trained for battle collapse in fear. As the angel touched down upon the earth, the ground trembled. The stone sealing the tomb, immense, heavy, meant to keep intruders out, was rolled away effortlessly, not pushed, not struggled with, rolled aside as though it weighed nothing, and then the angel sat on it, as if claiming it as a throne of victory. This act alone proclaimed something unmistakable. The stone had never been placed there to keep Jesus in. It had been placed to keep humanity out until the appointed moment. The angel was not there to help Jesus escape. He was there to invite witnesses in. This point is crucial. The angel did not resurrect Jesus. Jesus had already risen. Resurrection was an act of divine power, an act of the Son himself. In John chapter 10, Jesus declared that no one took his life from him, but that he laid it down of his own will and had the power to take it up again. The angel did not give life. The angel announced life. The angel did not initiate the miracle. The angel revealed the miracle. For the heavenly beings, this distinction mattered deeply. They had witnessed Jesus' authority in creation, in miracles, in teaching, and even in death. Now they witnessed his power over the grave. Their role was not to make resurrection happen, but to proclaim what had already taken place. The Roman guards stationed at the tomb reacted as any human would when confronted with a being glowing like lightning. Matthew records that they shook with fear and became like dead men. They collapsed, paralyzed by terror. The heavenly beings watching from above must have understood the irony. Hardened soldiers who feared nothing on earth were undone by one glimpse of heaven's radiance. Even this moment spoke a message no earthly force could stand against what God was doing. While the soldiers lay motionless, a small group of women approached the tomb. These were the same women who had stayed near Jesus during his suffering, who had watched where he was buried, and who came now at dawn with spices to honor his body. They were weary, grieving, and confused. They wondered who would roll the stone away for them, unaware that heaven had already moved it aside. When they entered the tomb, they encountered not one but two angels, described in shining garments. One spoke the words that had been waiting in heaven for a day and a half. "He is not here, for he is risen." This was the moment the angels had held their breath for. This was the message that turned sorrow into joy, darkness into light, and defeat into victory. The angels who had watched the crucifixion in silence were now the first heralds of resurrection, and that the mission was moving forward. The women ran, trembling with both fear and joy. The heavenly beings watched as the message began to spread, not through kings or priests, not through armies or empires, but through faithful witnesses whose hearts had been transformed by love. For the angels, this moment marked a profound shift in their role. They had witnessed pain. They had observed suffering. They had stood still in obedience during the hardest moment in the story of redemption. But now, obedience took the form of proclamation. Now they moved from watching the sacrifice to announcing the victory. The silence of Saturday was replaced with the thunder of Resurrection Sunday. Heaven, once muted with grief, now roared with triumph. In the garden near the empty tomb, the angels stood as radiant symbols of a new reality. Death had been defeated. The barrier had been broken. The story had turned from sorrow to celebration. And the heavenly beings, who had waited through the deepest darkness, were now the first to proclaim the light. After the angel proclaimed the resurrection, the story did not slow down. It unfolded with a new and rising momentum, and the heavenly beings continued to watch as Jesus appeared again and again to those who loved him. These appearances were not random moments. Each one carried purpose, clarity, and undeniable proof. And although Jesus himself stood before his followers, the angels remained deeply involved, observing, supporting, guiding, and ensuring that the truth of the resurrection was understood. The first appearance was to Mary Magdalene. She stood outside the tomb weeping, overwhelmed by grief and confusion. The angels who had spoken to her moments earlier watched as she turned and saw a man she assumed to be the gardener. But when he spoke her name, Mary, everything changed. Recognition flooded her face. The angels witnessed the transformation in an instant. Sorrow dissolved, hope ignited, and her voice became the first human declaration of the resurrection when she ran to the disciples saying, "I have seen the Lord." Festive. The heavenly beings continued to observe as Jesus appeared to the women returning from the tomb, offering them peace and commissioning them to share the news. Then he appeared to two disciples on the road to Emmaus. As they walked, confused and disappointed, Jesus himself explained the scriptures to them, showing how everything had pointed to his suffering and resurrection. The angels, who had long known these prophecies, listened as the author of Scripture interpreted every word. Later, Jesus appeared to the disciples behind locked doors. He showed them his hands and his side. He ate food in their presence. He breathed peace into their fear. 8 days later, he returned again specifically for Thomas, the disciple who had doubted. When Thomas touched the wounds, the angels heard him utter a confession they had spoken for eternity: "My Lord and my God." Goja. These appearances continued over 40 days, witnessed not only by individuals but by large groups including more than 500 people at once. Through each encounter, the angels understood that Jesus was preparing his followers for a mission that would spread across the world. And when the final day arrived, the angels stood present at the Mount of Olives as Jesus ascended into heaven. Acts chapter 1, verse 11 preserves their message. "This same Jesus, who has been taken from you into heaven, will come again in the same way you have seen him go." Also, from that moment forward, the angels continued their ministry. They supported believers, guarded them, guided them, and strengthened them as they carried the message of the resurrection. They had witnessed the risen Lord, and now they served as allies to those who proclaimed his victory. Heaven and earth were united in the mission, and the angels moved with purpose, helping ensure that the world would hear the truth that changed history forever. As we look back on everything the heavenly beings witnessed, from the agony of Gethsemane to the violence of Golgotha, from the darkness at midday to the silence of Saturday, a natural question rises: why did they not intervene? These were not passive spectators. These were beings of extraordinary power, beings who had defended prophets, shut the mouths of lions, and defeated armies when commanded. The absence of angelic intervention was not due to weakness, it was due to purpose. To understand this moment, we must reflect on the deeper theological reasons that shaped their silence. The first truth is this: power does not drive history, obedience to God's will does. The angels had the ability to stop everything. The moment Jesus spoke of more than 12 legions of angels in Matthew chapter 26, verse 53, the heavenly beings knew exactly what he meant. They could have descended instantly. They could have healed his wounds, scattered the soldiers, overturned the trials, and prevented the crucifixion entirely. But divine instructions had already been given. The plan of redemption, set before the foundation of the world, required that Jesus walk the road to the cross. For angels, obedience is not a mere duty. It is their very nature. They do not move without command. They do not improvise. They live in continual surrender to the will of God. And so, when the Father did not command intervention, their power remained restrained by their perfect loyalty. This leads to the second truth. The crucifixion was not a tragedy that needed rescue. It was a sacrifice that needed completion. The angels knew Jesus could save himself. They had seen him calm storms with a word, raise the dead with a command, and confront darkness with absolute authority. But on the cross, love took the form of surrender. Jesus was not overpowered. He was offering himself. The angels, who had watched God's justice throughout history, now saw a deeper truth: love achieves what power cannot. Redemption required a willing sacrifice, not a rescue mission. And so, although their instinct was to protect, they submitted to a love greater than their understanding. A third theological dimension appears in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, which explains that angels desire to look into the mysteries of salvation. This means they are not omniscient. They do not know the full scope of God's plan until it unfolds. In the crucifixion, they were learning something profoundly new about the heart of God. They had seen his power, his justice, his holiness, but now they saw his mercy expressed in the most extreme way possible. They watched the Creator suffer for His creation. They observed the Son experience abandonment so that humanity could experience acceptance. And they began to understand that salvation was not an idea, it was a costly act of love. There is also an ethical lesson woven into this moment. In heaven, obedience is the highest form of alignment with God's character. For humans, obedience often feels restrictive, but for angels, obedience is freedom, the freedom to serve within the perfect wisdom of God. Their choice to remain still teaches us that submission to God's will, even when it feels painful or confusing, is part of the moral fabric of creation. The angels trusted the Father's plan even when they could not see the end. Their stillness reminds us that faith is not only active, sometimes it is patient. Finally, the resurrection vindicated everything. When Jesus rose, every question the angels carried was answered. Their silence on Friday became their proclamation on Sunday. Their restraint transformed into rejoicing. Their confusion turned into clarity. The resurrection proved that the silence of heaven had not been abandonment, it had been preparation for victory. The angels moved from witnessing sorrow to announcing triumph, from standing guard at the cross to sitting on the rolled-away stone as heralds of life. In the end, the angels did not fail to act. They fulfilled their role perfectly. They obeyed, they watched, they learned, and they proclaimed. And through their obedience, the story of redemption unfolded exactly as God intended, through sacrifice, through resurrection, and through a love so deep that even heaven bowed in awe. As we step back from the cosmic scale of this story, the question becomes personal. What does all of this mean for us today? The journey of the angels through the crucifixion and resurrection is not only a window into heaven's perspective, it is also a mirror for our own lives. Their obedience, their waiting, and their trust reveal truths that can shape how we face our own struggles. One of the clearest lessons is the call to obedience, even when the path is painful. The angels had the power to stop the suffering of Jesus, yet they submitted to the Father's plan because they understood that some purposes are larger than immediate relief. In our own lives, we also face moments when the right choice requires endurance. We walk through seasons of difficulty, disappointment, or heartbreak, and yet obedience, choosing what is true, good, and faithful, becomes our way of participating in God's greater story. Another lesson comes from the sense of injustice the angels witnessed. They saw Jesus falsely accused, mistreated, and condemned. But they also saw that God was using what looked like injustice to fulfill redemption. When we confront unfair situations, we often feel powerless or angry. Yet this story reminds us to see our circumstances in the context of God's larger plan. What feels unbearable in the moment may be shaping something we cannot yet understand. We also learn from Jesus in Gethsemane. His prayer, honest, vulnerable, surrendered, shows us the pattern for our own prayers. We can bring our fears, our desires, and our struggles before God, and then choose to trust His will. And like the angels waiting through the silent Saturday, we too have seasons when we feel stuck between loss and hope. In those moments, we hold on, we wait, we trust that resurrection is coming. So here is a question for you, as a gentle invitation to reflect. In your own life, what feels like a silent Saturday right now? Share it in the comments if you feel comfortable. You may discover that you are not waiting alone. As we come to the end of this journey, the story becomes clear. The heavenly beings witnessed every moment, from the agony in Gethsemane to the suffering on the cross, from the silence of Saturday to the victory of resurrection morning. They obeyed when obedience was painful. They remained still when action seemed natural. And when the time came, they became the first heralds of the greatest news the world has ever heard. In their witness, we see a picture of devotion, patience, and trust that reflects the very heart of God. The cross is not only a place of suffering, it is the place where heaven and earth met in a lesson about redeeming love. It is where justice and mercy collided. It is where the angels learned the depth of God's plan, and where we learn that love is stronger than death, silence, or darkness. If this journey has moved you, I invite you to respond. Please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, and subscribe so you will not miss future content. Leave a comment below and tell me what part of this story spoke to you most deeply. You can also find the link to download the full transcript and script in the description.